Imagine watching strangers build 35 houses on the very soil your grandfather bled to protect. Every letter you wrote was ignored. Every door you knocked on was slammed in your face. Until one stormy night, you turned the wheel on the old dam. They had forgotten, but Roland Drexel hadn't. The sound that night wasn't thunder. It wasn't machinery. It was water, furious, alive, and unstoppable, racing across streets that hadn't even existed just weeks earlier. And at the center of it all stood Roland, a man his new neighbors had brushed aside, dismissed, or outright ignored. To them, he was just a middle-aged landowner clinging to old property. But to him, that land was everything: bloodline, memory, and promise. When they built over it without his permission, they awakened something they never expected. A reckoning carried by the current of a dam they never even bothered to ask about. The story of Roland Drexel isn't fiction. It could be anyone's story in a country where land and legacy often collide with greed and power. Picture a stretch of farmland just outside Raleigh, North Carolina. Rolling green fields slope toward a modest creek. Hidden behind the tree line sits a dam built decades ago by Roland's grandfather. It wasn't grand or monumental, just a small, sturdy structure. Enough to keep the Drexel family crops alive during dry seasons. But to Roland's family, that dam meant more than water. It was proof that his grandfather had carved out a place in a world that tried to push him aside. When Roland inherited the land at 58, he didn't dream of subdivisions or development deals. His mind drifted to memories of childhood summers, chasing fireflies across fields, watching his father point out the boundaries, and learning how his grandfather had kept the dam alive with his own sweat. For Roland, this wasn't just soil and water. It was permanence in a county that had always whispered that families like his didn't belong. But permanence has a way of being tested. Not long after Roland settled into retirement, the letters started arriving. They came from the Bradford Creek Homeowners Association, signed by Marjorie Kellerton, the HOA president, at first. The letters were polite, cloaked in corporate niceties that masked their real message. Your land is underutilized. You might consider partnership opportunities with developers who could maximize the property's potential. Roland barely skimmed them before crumpling each one and tossing it into the trash. He didn't see them as worth his time, but the letters were only the first rumble of a storm. Weeks later, survey stakes appeared, thin wooden poles with orange ribbons fluttering in the breeze, marking land that didn't belong to them. Roland called the county office. He was put on hold. He called again. An assistant promised to look into it. Nothing changed. Then, one morning, Roland woke to the roar of bulldozers. From his porch, he watched workers drive heavy equipment across his land, carving dirt roads where cattle once grazed. He stormed onto the site, boots sinking into mud, arms waving furiously. "This is my property," he shouted. A man in a hard hat looked down from his machine and shrugged. Another worker pointed to a laminated permit stapled to a wooden stake. The name on it wasn't Drexel, it was Kelton. "You can't just take this." Roland's voice cracked with rage. The foreman, clipboard in hand, didn't even look up. "Sir, you'll need to bring that up with the HOA." So Roland did. By the time he reached the HOA office in a brand new strip mall, Marjorie Kellerton was waiting for him. Blonde hair cut sharp at the shoulders, pearl earrings, and a tone dripping with condescension. "Mr. Drexel," she said smoothly, "we've been over this. The land wasn't being used to its full potential. We had approvals. The community needs housing, and your acreage was the perfect fit." Roland leaned across her desk, his hands trembling. "That land was my father's, my grandfather's. You don't get to decide what it's worth." Marjorie didn't flinch. She leaned back in her leather chair, voice calm and cutting. "With all due respect, Mr. Drexel, progress doesn't wait for nostalgia. Those words sliced deeper than any blade. Nostalgia, that's what she called his inheritance, his family's sweat. Their sacrifice. In the weeks that followed, the construction didn't slow, it accelerated. Foundations poured. Walls rose. Roofs were shingled. 35 homes stood where Roland's memories once lived. County officials shrugged. The paperwork, they said, was in order. Neighbors whispered that he was making a fuss. And through it all, Marjorie Kellerton smiled confident. Everything was going exactly as planned. But there was one thing they had all forgotten. One detail they had overlooked in their rush to build, pave, and claim. Behind the trees, behind the fences, the dam still stood. Old, yes, but strong, and more importantly, it still belonged to Roland Drexel. And if the bulldozers had shaken his patience, what came next would test his breaking point. Asterisk for Roland. The land was never just property, was a legacy to maintain, a torch, passed from his grandfather to his father, and now to him. As a teenager, Roland spent summers repairing fences, clearing brush, and hauling buckets of water during droughts. While other kids dreamed of escaping small-town life, Roland understood the truth. The land was in his blood. So when his father, Victor, passed away and the property became his, there was no hesitation. He didn't see it as a burden. He saw it as continuity. That first morning after inheriting the farm, Roland stood at the edge of the dam, the rising sun reflecting off the reservoir. He whispered into the cool air, "I'll keep it standing, I promise." That vow carried him into retirement. After nearly 3 decades as an electrical engineer at a Durham plant, Roland had saved diligently, lived modestly, and looked forward to quiet days walking the land at sunrise, fixing things at his own pace, maybe teaching his niece's kids how to fish in the same creek his grandfather once showed him. Retirement was supposed to be peace. But dreams like that rarely survive when progress comes knocking. It began subtly. Strangers parked their trucks near his property line. At first, Roland thought they were hunters, but then he saw the tools, tripods, survey wheels, and flashing red laser levels. He marched down to confront them. "Morning," he called, planting his hands on his hips. "You mind telling me what you're doing on my property?" One of the surveyors, a young man in a neon vest, didn't even look up, just marking boundaries for the new development. Roland's brow furrowed. New development? This land isn't for sale. The man finally glanced up, frowning like. Roland was the trespasser. "You'll have to take that up with the HOA, sir. We're just contractors." The words "new development" clanged in Roland's ears like a church bell. That night, he rummaged through his father's old lockbox, pulling out every deed and document he could find. Each one confirmed what he already knew. Every acre was still in the Drexel name, his name. When he told his sister, "Bernice, what was happening?" she stared in disbelief. "Roland, that can't be right. Nobody can just walk in and take what's yours." Roland sighed, rubbing his temples. "You'd think. But they're not asking. They're just building." Bernice's voice hardened. "Then you remind them who that land belongs to." But reminders didn't matter. Paper meant nothing against concrete being poured and houses rising out of the soil. The more Roland fought, the more invisible he became. Yet every night when he passed the dam, he felt the same steady current his grandfather had once relied on. It was still his, the water, the reservoir, the control. No survey stake could take that away. But while Roland clung to his inheritance, another figure was preparing to challenge him head-on. Her name was Marjorie Kellerton, where Roland spoke, with patience, choosing his words carefully. Marjorie was the opposite, quick to fill silence, polished, and always ready to smile in public. At 52, she had spent nearly 2 decades climbing the social ladder of Bradford Creek Estates, a neighborhood where HOA bylaws were treated like scripture, Her background wasn't farming or engineering. She came from real estate, where land was. Inventory and character was measured in square footage. In her mind, she wasn't a villain. She was a builder, shaping the communities of tomorrow. But for those who stood in her way, her polished charm barely concealed her arrogance. Their first real confrontation happened in a cramped HOA office. Inside what had once been a dentist's clinic, wedged between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner, Roland stormed in after watching bulldozers chew through the fields that had fed his grandfather's corn. His voice was raw from shouting over engines as he slammed his palms on Marjorie's desk. "You're trespassing," he barked. "That land is mine. I've got the paperwork to prove it." Marjorie leaned back slowly, folding her hands like she was the only adult in the room. "Mr. Drexel, I understand you're upset. Change can be difficult. But this project was approved through all the proper channels. The community voted. The permits are signed." Roland's jaw tightened. "I never signed anything. My family never sold an acre." For a flicker of a moment, Marjorie's smile faltered. But she recovered quickly, tilting her head as if explaining something simple to a stubborn child. The county determined the land wasn't being used productively. You weren't farming, you weren't developing, you weren't building. It's called eminent domain. Asterisk Mr. Drexel, it happens all the time. Marjorie's tone was cool, almost rehearsed. Roland leaned across her desk, his voice dropping low and steady. "That land has been ours for 70 years. My grandfather built that dam with his own hands. Don't you dare call it unused." Marjorie's lips pressed into a polite smile. "And yet, Mr. Drexel, look outside. Families need homes. Children need schools. Communities need growth. Sometimes history has to make room for progress." History has to make room. The words echoed in Roland's chest like a warning bell. He realized in that moment Marjorie wasn't someone he could reason with. She didn't see the Drexel land as legacy. She saw it as leverage. Over the next few weeks, Roland saw her fingerprints everywhere. At town meetings, she stood proudly at the podium, armed with glossy brochures showing artists' renderings of cul-de-sacs, kids riding bikes, dog walkers strolling under glowing street lamps. "This development," she declared at one meeting, "will bring new families, new jobs, and new tax revenue. It's exactly what Cumberland County needs." From the back of the room, Roland's voice cut through the crowd. "That's my property." Heads turned. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Others whispered dismissively, writing him off as a stubborn old man who couldn't let go of the past. Marjorie didn't flinch. She raised her voice, unshaken. "The paperwork is in order. The county approved it. Progress is never easy, but it's always necessary." Later, outside the meeting, Roland cornered a county commissioner, Douglas Reeves, a nervous man clutching a briefcase like a shield. "You know that land is mine," Roland said, his voice like stone. Reeves shuffled, avoiding eye contact. "Mr. Drexel, I sympathize, but once these projects get moving, it's hard to stop. You'll be compensated fairly. It's maybe not what you wanted, but fair." Roland's fists clenched. "You can't put a price on history." Reeves muttered something about bigger forces at play before hurrying off to his car. That was the moment Roland realized the machinery chewing up his land wasn't just physical, it was political. The system wasn't built to hear him. It was built to keep people like Marjorie comfortable and people like him invisible. A week later, Roland tried one more time. He brought his niece Tanya with him to the HOA office, hoping her fiery spirit would break through Marjorie's walls. "My uncle has the deed," Tanya snapped, slamming documents onto the desk. "You're trespassing. You're stealing." Marjorie barely glanced at the papers. "Those documents are outdated. You'll need to take it up with the courts." Meanwhile, Construction continues. Roland's voice burned with fury. You're gambling with something you don't own. Marjorie finally stood, her smile hardening into something cold. Mr. Drexel, let me be clear. The community voted for me to lead on. I will. You can spend the rest of your days clinging to a crumbling dam, or you can move on. The choice is yours. For the first time, Roland saw her mask slip. This wasn't arrogance, it was calculation. She wasn't bluffing. She was daring him to give up. But Roland wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. If anything, the construction only hardened his resolve. The sound of machinery became his new alarm clock. Sunrise used to mean the call of meadowlarks, the trickle of water spilling from the dam. Now it was the grind of backhoes, the slam of dump trucks, the staccato hammering of nail guns. Every morning, Roland walked to the edge of his land, boots sinking into damp earth, watching strangers reshape the soil his grandfather had bled for. Houses rose faster than he thought possible. What started as dirt roads carved across his pasture sprouted foundations, then lumber frames that climbed skyward like skeletons. Plastic wrap-bearing construction company logos flapped in the wind. It felt like his inheritance was being swallowed. In fast motion, while he stood helplessly still, neighbors began driving by just to gawk. Some slowed, rolling down windows to admire the rows of new homes stretching across the horizon. One evening at the corner gas station, Roland overheard two men chatting. "Those new builds look sharp," one said. "Yeah," the other replied, sipping a soda. "HOA says prices will jump as soon as they're finished. Great investment for the neighborhood." Roland stepped into view, his voice tight. "That investment was my family's land. They didn't ask. They didn't buy. They just took it." The men exchanged glances. One shrugged. "Look, man, progress is progress. Can't stop it." Roland's stomach knotted the same hollow feeling. He got every time an official brushed him off. To everyone else, these were just houses, new lawns, new driveways. Promises of rising property values to Roland. They were trespassing monuments. The humiliations came in small ways, too. Trucks parked on his grass, leaving deep ruts. Delivery vans rattled past with stacks of shingles. Once, he even found a group of workers sitting on his porch steps, unwrapping sandwiches like they owned the place. "Get off my porch," he ordered. One of them smirked, chewing with his mouth open. "Relax, old man. Soon this'll all be part of the neighborhood anyway." That line followed Roland home like a curse. The new residents arrived even before construction finished young couples with toddlers, retirees chasing quiet cul-de-sacs, families with dogs. They waved politely, assuming Roland was just another neighbor. One woman approached him one afternoon, smiling warmly. "Hi, I'm Angela Rowan. We just moved into Lot 12. Isn't this area wonderful?" Roland's stare was cold. It was before. "They built over my field." Angela blinked, her smile faltering. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize." She adjusted her sunglasses and retreated without another word. But not everyone was. Apologetic at a neighborhood gathering organized by Marjorie herself, Roland showed up to make his case directly. Families spread folding chairs in the cul-de-sac. Kids darted around with popsicles. Marjorie stood near a portable speaker, clipboard in hand, greeting residents like a seasoned campaigner. When Roland approached, the chatter around them faded. "Mr. Drexel," Marjorie said smoothly. "Strict, sir." Voice carried smoothly over the gathering. "We didn't expect you tonight." Roland's chest tightened. "Didn't expect me?" "You're building on my land, you should expect me every single day." Murmurs rippled through the group. A man in a polo shirt leaned toward his wife and whispered, "Isn't that the guy who keeps complaining?" Roland raised his voice, his hands trembling not from age, but from fury. This development is built on theft. My grandfather cleared this ground. My father kept it alive. And now you treat it like some empty slate to scribble on." Marjorie's smile sharpened. She stepped forward, her tone cool but cutting. "Mr. Drexel, please. We've been through this. You're distressing the community with your accusations. Everyone here deserves peace in their homes." Roland's jaw clenched as he locked eyes with her. Peace doesn't come from stealing. It comes from respect. The silence that followed was heavy. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others refused to meet his gaze. Sensing control slipping, Marjorie quickly redirected. "Let's all remember," she said brightly, "we're building a future, here homes families. Safety. And sometimes building the future means leaving the past behind." Roland turned on his heel and walked out, but her words stuck like burrs. Leaving the past behind. To her, it was a dismissal of his history, his legacy, as if it meant nothing. That night, back at the dam, Roland sat on the embankment under the pale glow of the moon. The water rippled steadily below him, the old reservoir brimming after recent rains. His hand rested on the rusted wheel that controlled the gates, the cold steel grounding him. Across the distance, the harsh construction lights buzzed against. The dark sky, tracing outlines of the new houses rising on stolen soil. "They think I'll just walk away," he whispered to the night, as though his father and grandfather were still listening. "But they don't know me." Yet, even as Roland clung fiercely to the land's memory, the system meant to protect him was already turning against him. The first step seemed obvious. Prove ownership. He dug out his father's old lockbox, spreading deeds and records across his kitchen table. He highlighted every line that confirmed the Drexel name proof the land was theirs, written in ink and notarized. Surely, once officials saw these documents, the mistake would be corrected. The next morning, Roland drove into downtown Fayetteville and entered the Cumberland County Register of Deeds office. The air smelled of toner and stale coffee. Behind the counter, a young clerk with earbuds dangling from her shirt barely looked up. "I need to speak with someone about a land dispute," Roland said firmly, clutching the papers. "Fill out the request form," she replied flatly. Sliding a clipboard across the counter without lifting her eyes from her phone, by the time he was finally led to an official, a middle-aged man named Mr. Collier. Roland's patience was thin. He spread the deeds on the desk, his finger tapping against the embossed seal. "This is my land. They're building on it without my consent." Collier glanced at the papers, then at his computer screen. "According to our system, the land is listed under the Development Authority." Roland's voice rose, his face flushed with disbelief. "Then your system is wrong. Look at this DD. See my name right there." Collier sighed, rubbing his temples. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but once development permits are issued, reversing them is complicated. You'd have to challenge it in civil court. Meanwhile, they're pouring concrete and putting roofs on my soil." Roland snapped. Collier only shrugged a tired, bureaucratic gesture that said more than words ever could. "That's not something we handle here." It felt like shouting into a void. Later that week, Roland met with local attorney Jeffrey Harlan, whose office sat above a pawn shop. Harlan flipped through the paperwork with weary eyes. "You've got a strong case," he said at last. "But cases like this take time, months, maybe years. By then, those houses will already be built." Roland leaned forward. "So they steal from me, and I just have to wait." The lawyer met his gaze. "That's how the system works, Mr. Drexel. They build faster than the courts move." Roland slammed his hand against the table. "Then what good is a deed if nobody respects it?" Harlan didn't answer. Word of Roland's fight spread through town, but instead of support, he found isolation. At the grocery store, people whispered when he walked past. At church one Sunday, an old acquaintance approached him after service. "Roland, maybe it's best to let it go. Times change. You don't want to be the man who holds everything up." "Holding everything up," Roland repeated, stunned. "I'm not stopping progressing, holding on to what's mine." The man raised his hands. "I'm just saying, it's not worth the stress." Even his niece, Tanya, fiery as she'd been at the HOA office, tried to reason with him over dinner. "Uncle, I know it's wrong. I know they're stealing from you. But the courts, the county, they've already decided. Fighting like this could break you." Roland set his fork down with a heavy clink. "Then let it break me. I'd rather break fighting than bend to them." Tears welled in Tanya's eyes. "Granddaddy would be proud, but he'd also want you safe. Promise me you won't do something reckless." Roland's silence was answer enough. Weeks dragged on. He sent certified letters to county commissioners, met with state representatives who smiled politely before brushing him aside, and even called a local news station. A producer promised to pass the message along. Nobody ever called back. Meanwhile, the subdivision grew. Asphalt paved new roads, street signs went up, mailboxes appeared in neat rows. Children played in driveways while parents wheeled trash bins to the curb. From his porch, Roland watched it all like a man staring through glass at a life stolen from him. The worst came when a notice arrived in his mailbox, stamped with the HOA's logo. In bold letters, it read, "Notice of NAN-compliance." They accused him of failing to maintain his property in alignment with neighborhood standards and threatened fines. Roland let out a bitter laugh. First, they steal my land. Now, they fine me for not mowing it their way. He drove straight to the HOA office, notice crumpled in his fist, and slammed it onto Marjorie Kelton's desk. "You people steal my land, and now you send me fines for not following your neighborhood rules." Marjorie leaned back, calm as ever. "Mr. Drexel, we're simply asking for cooperation. The community thrives when everyone contributes." Roland's voice thundered. "I never agreed to your community. This land is mine." Her smile barely flickered. "Then perhaps it's time you reconsider whether this is the right place for you." It wasn't just theft anymore. It was humiliation. The system had silenced him, his neighbors dismissed him, and now the trespassers dared to dictate how he should live on his own land. That evening, Roland walked to the dam. The wheel felt cool under his palm, the reservoir swollen from weeks of steady rain. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. "Don't you ever let anyone tell you otherwise." But while courts stalled and officials shrugged, the skies were changing. The spring rains came early, not gentle showers, but pounding storms that filled every ditch and low stretch of ground. Rain had always been a blessing. It kept the reservoir alive, preserving his family's history with every gallon. It held, but this year the rain didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like pressure pressing on him the same way water pressed against the dam's rusted gates. One evening, soaked beneath his old baseball cap, Roland stared at the swollen reservoir. The water had risen nearly to the edge, brown and restless. His boots sank into the mud as he walked the embankment, flashlight catching debris floating on the surface. The roar of water vibrated in his chest. "They don't see it. They don't care," he whispered into the rain. "But they will." The thought scared him as much as it comforted him. He wasn't a violent man. It always followed the rules. Worked hard, saved, lived by the law. But for the first time, he felt like a man with no rules left to follow. That night, he drove into town to meet his old friend Clarence Boyd, a retired mechanic he'd known since high school. They sat in a booth at the Waffle House, steam rising from mugs of black coffee. Clarence studied Roland's face and shook his head. "You're carrying too much anger, brother. It's eating you alive." Roland pushed his cup away. They've taken everything my family built. I tried the courts, the county, even the press. Nobody listens. Nobody cares. It's like we never existed. Clarence leaned closer. So what are you thinking of doing? Roland's eyes glistened. I'm thinking maybe it's time they felt what it means to take from me. Clarence frowned. Don't talk like that. You're not that man. Roland's voice cracked. Then what man am I supposed to be, Clarence? The one who just watches while strangers bury my grandfather's sweat under vinyl siding and white picket fences? They've erased us like we were never here. The waitress came by with a pot of coffee, breaking the heavy silence. Roland shook his head when she offered a refill. When she left, Clarence put a firm hand on his friend's shoulder. Clarence's voice cut through the storm. Listen to me, that dam, your family's dam. It's not just a reservoir, it's power. Once you open that gate, you won't be able to close what follows. Do you understand? Roland met his eyes, steady. Maybe that's the point. Clarence faltered, struggling for words. Finally, he spoke softly. Promise me you'll think before you act. You can't fight arrogance with consume you. Roland gave no reply. That night, the storm raged on. Lightning slashed across the horizon, illuminating rows of new houses that had sprung up like weeds. Their windows glowed warmly, families eating dinner. Children sprawled in front of televisions, dogs barking at shadows. Roland stood at his window, his reflection faint in the glass. To them, he was an invisibly bitter old man clinging to the past. But inside, he knew who he was. Isaac's grandson, Victor's son. Heir to every scar and every triumph his family had carved into that land. He wasn't a ghost. He was flesh and blood. The next morning, Tanya arrived unannounced. She slipped through the kitchen door, her face pale with worry. "Uncle," she said firmly, "I know what you're thinking. Don't. There are other ways." Roland's eyes were heavy. Other ways. Show me one door I haven't knocked on. One person who's listened. Tears welled in Tanya's eyes. "I don't want to lose you. You're all I have left of Granddaddy." Roland cupped her shoulder, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Then you know why I can't let them erase us. If I don't stand, then what was his struggle for?" Tanya shook her head, sobbing quietly. "Standing doesn't mean flooding families out. You'll destroy everything." Roland turned away, staring toward the dam. Sometimes destruction is the only way people learn to listen. That evening, rain still falling, he returned to the embankment. The wheel that controlled the gates gleamed slick in the storm. His hands hovered over it, trembling. Clarence's warning, Tanya's pleas. His grandfather's voice, they all clashed inside his head like thunder. "If they won't hear my words," he whispered into the storm, "then they'll hear my water." But gripping the wheel was one thing, turning it was another. He knew once he crossed that line, there would be no return. The storm didn't relent for 3 days. Rain hammered the rooftops of the new subdivision, water pooling in driveways, gutters overflowing into yards. Behind it all, the Drexel Dam strained under the swollen current. Roland hardly slept. He paced endlessly, the rain against the windows following him like a reminder of the choice pressing down on his chest. Tanya called twice that day, her voice breaking. "Promise me you won't do anything crazy." "I'm just watching the water," he lied. "Uncle, I mean it. Don't let them drag you down with them." But he hung up, unable to promise what he couldn't keep. On the third night, Clarence arrived, rain slapping against his windshield. He found Roland sitting in his truck, staring at the dam. "Roland," Clarence shouted over the storm, "don't do this." Roland's voice was hoarse. "I tried everything. They treat me like I don't exist." "You open that gate," Clarence pressed, "and it won't just wash away wood and concrete. It'll wash away you. You'll end up in prison. Is that what your father would want?" Roland's hands trembled on the steering wheel. He thought of Isaac, of Victor, of every promise whispered into that soil. His eyes burned. "What would they want, Clarence? For me to watch our land get paved over? For strangers to build playgrounds where our corn once stood? I'm not destroying what they built. I'm defending it." Clarence shook his head. "Defending is one thing. Flooding out families is another. You'll make yourself the villain." "In their story, they already cast me as the villain," Roland growled. "The day they ignored my deed." Rain streamed down Clarence's face. He sighed, voice heavy. "If you do this, you'll lose me too. I can't stand by." Roland's throat tightened, but he didn't argue. He only watched Clarence's taillights fade into the storm. Alone again, Roland walked to the dam. The path was muddy, the air alive with the scent of wet soil and ozone. He gripped the rusted wheel with both hands. Cold, slick, unyielding. He thought of Tanya's tears, Clarence's warning, his grandfather's voice. "Don't you ever let anyone tell you otherwise." The houses across the field glowed faintly under storm clouds, their warm lights twinkling like stars. Families sat safe, inside eating dinner, drying laundry, tucking children into bed, unaware that the ground beneath them still belonged to another man. Roland whispered, almost a prayer. "You'll remember me now." With a grunt, he turned the wheel. At first, it resisted, stiff with rust. He pushed harder, muscles straining, rain streaming down his face. Inch by inch, the wheel groaned, then suddenly gave way. The gate cracked open. Water surged through with a roar louder than the thunder. The reservoir spilled into the creek, swelling into a raging torrent. Backyards turned to streams. Water climbed over sidewalks, lapped at garage doors, swallowed flower beds. Porch lights flickered out as the current surged against power boxes. Roland stood on the embankment. Rain pouring over him, his chest heaving. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He only watched, as if the flood was speaking in a language only he could understand. From the distance, shouts carried through the storm. Families scrambled, headlights cutting through the darkness. Cars backing desperately out of driveways. The water roared through the streets, swallowing driveways and tearing lawns apart. To the families of Bradford Creek, it was chaos. To Roland, it was truth raw and undeniable. His hands gripped the dam's wheel as it spun freely, the flood no longer his to control. "Now you'll listen," he whispered, his voice carried. By dawn, the subdivision looked nothing like the glossy brochures Marjorie Kelton once held up in meetings. Streets meant to symbolize promise were buried in thick mud. Freshly laid lawns peeled away in soggy sheets, fences bent sideways, and driveways cracked under the surge. Families stumbled through knee-deep water, clutching children and trash. Bags filled with whatever they could save. A woman wept on her porch as water seeped under her front door, soaking the home she had only just furnished. Pickup trucks lined the higher ground, headlights cutting through the mist as neighbors helped one another escape. Roland stood at the tree line, soaked, sleepless, his eyes red. The dam's gate still gushed behind him, fueling the destruction. He wanted to feel vindicated, but instead, his chest ached with hollow grief. Marjorie arrived just after sunrise, pearl earrings glinting even as her confidence cracked. She barked orders, directing families toward higher ground. But when her eyes met Roland's across the field, she froze, then stormed toward him. "Do you see what you've done?" she hissed. Roland's gaze held steady. "What I've done, Nor. What you refused to stop." Her voice shook. "These people have children. They trusted me. They trusted this neighborhood and now look." She flung her hand toward the drowned homes. Roland stepped closer, boots sinking into the mud. My father planted corn where your houses stand. My grandfather built that dam with his bare hands. You didn't just ruin 35 homes, Marjorie. You ruined 70 years of history. And you thought I'd just sit on my porch while you erased us? Silence cut between them. Marjorie's lips parted, but no words came. Behind her, neighbors struggled to salvage mattresses, their children crying softly in the rain. At last, she whispered, "You've made yourself a criminal." Roland's eyes glistened not with fear, but with grief. Maybe, but at least I made myself visible. Deputies arrived within the hour, their cruisers crawling through flooded streets, blue lights flashing. They helped families to safety before approaching Roland with measured caution. "Mr. Drexel," one called. Roland didn't move. "That's me. You'll need to come with us." Before he could respond, his niece Tanya appeared, rain plastering her hair to her cheeks. "Uncle, please," she cried. "Don't fight them." Roland turned to her, weary but steady. "I'm not fighting anymore." He extended his wrists, offering no resistance as the cuffs clicked shut. Some neighbors muttered crazy and dangerous. Others just stared, caught between anger and pity. Marjorie stood stiffly apart, arms crossed, her slogans and polished speeches stripped away by the flood. She had no words left as deputies guided Roland to the cruiser. Tanya grabbed his arm. "Why, Uncle? Why go this far?" He paused, looking at her with rain-blurred eyes. "Because sometimes words aren't enough. Sometimes people only see the truth when it crashes through their front door." The door slammed shut, and the cruiser crawled up the hill, tires hissing against the wet asphalt. Behind them, families carried soaked furniture to trucks, children huddled under umbrellas. Bradford Creek Estates, once a symbol of growth and safety, now stood as a monument to arrogance and to the power one man still had when everyone thought he was powerless. The water would recede, homes would be repaired, streets repaved. But the deeper damage, the knowledge that their future was built on another man's stolen past, could never be erased. The perfect neighborhood was perfect no more. Families who once bragged about manicured lawns and quiet streets could no longer ignore the truth. They had moved onto land built on another man's legacy, a legacy they dismissed until the flood forced them to reckon with it. Roland Drexel sat in the county jail, his clothes still damp when they booked him in. The cell was bare, the air thick with bleach. Across from him sat a wiry inmate with tired eyes who studied Roland before asking, "What did they get you for, old man?" Roland exhaled slowly, "For turning a wheel." The man laughed, shaking his head. "Must have been one hell of a wheel." Roland didn't answer. He didn't need to. He leaned back against the concrete wall, closing his eyes, letting silence replace the anger that had lived in him for too long. 2 days later, Tanya visited. She pressed her palms against the glass, tears streaking down her cheeks. "Oh, they're saying you'll face charges: reckless endangerment, property damage. Some are even pushing for terrorism." Roland picked up the phone, his voice steady. "Through the static, they can call it what they want, but they'll never call it theft, not when it's the county and the HOA doing the stealing." Her lips trembled. Was it worth it? Roland looked at her for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Ask them. Ask the families who bought houses on stolen land if they think it was worth it." Meanwhile, Marjorie Kelton found herself cornered in ways she never imagined. News crews camped outside her office, microphones shoved in her face. Did the HOA knowingly build on disputed land? One asked. What responsibility does the board take for the flood damage? Another pressed her rehearsed lines we followed. All proper channels. The community comes first. Sounded weaker every time she said them. Then a reporter cut through the script. If the land wasn't Drexel's, why hasn't the county been able to produce a clean title? Marjorie blinked. her carefully painted smile faltering. For the first time in years, she had no answer. At a community meeting a week later, the shift was undeniable. Families who once mocked Roland now sat in folding chairs. Their faces hardened not just at him, but at the HOA that had promised them security. A father, Robert Lanham, stood and raised his voice. "You told us this was all legal. You told us this land was free and clear. Now our homes are ruined, our kids are scared, and our insurance companies won't pay because ownership is in question. Were we lied to, Marjorie?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Marjorie clutched her clipboard, knuckles white. The paperwork was approved. She insisted. "Approved doesn't mean right," Robert snapped. "That man warned us, over and over. And we laughed at him. Maybe we should have listened." The words hung in the air like smoke. Across town, Clarence sat at his kitchen table, the news flickering on his TV. He'd known Roland for decades, seen both his pride and his stubbornness. Clarence had begged him not to open the damn, but part of him now wondered if Roland had forced the only conversation that could ever make people see. Because what had the flood really done? It hadn't killed anyone, hadn't destroyed beyond repair. But it had shattered illusions that land could be taken without consequence, that history could be paved over without a price. Roland thought about that too, lying awake in his cell. He wasn't proud of what he had done. He wasn't ashamed either. He knew he wouldn't be remembered as just a stubborn old man fighting an HOA. He'd be remembered as the man who forced his community to face the truth. On her next visit, Tanya asked him quietly, "Uncle, what lesson do you want people to take from this?" Roland pressed his hand against the glass, his voice soft but unwavering. "That progress isn't progress if it erases the people who came before you. Respect has to come before development. Otherwise, you're just building on sand. And one day, the water will remind you who really owns the ground you're standing on." Outside the jail, the skies were clear again. But in Bradford Creek Estates, the storm hadn't passed. It lingered in muddy footprints, in warped floorboards, in uneasy glances between neighbors who now wondered if they had been complicit in another man's loss. They wouldn't admit it out loud, but the truth had already carved itself into their minds. Roland Drexel had forced them to see what they chose to ignore. Weeks passed. The water receded. Insurance companies tallied their payouts, and contractors discussed repairs. Yet silence hung over the subdivision like a shadow. The glossy brochures had promised safety, growth, and comfort. Instead, Bradford Creek Estates had become a monument to arrogance. Asterisk. Roland Drexel's name was everywhere. At diners in Fayetteville, people debated him over plates of grits and eggs. Some called him reckless, a criminal who had endangered lives. Others said he was a man pushed past his breaking point. But whether they admired him or despised him, one truth remained: no one could ignore him anymore. Marjorie Kelton, once the polished face of the HOA, had fallen silent. The local paper ran editorials questioning both the HOA's authority and the county's role in the scandal. At a town council meeting, a commissioner who had once dismissed Roland admitted quietly, "We failed to respect due process." Thin words, but words that never would have been spoken without the flood in his cell. Roland didn't care about headlines or apologies. What mattered were Tanya's Sunday visits. She came with books, with news, with quiet strength. One day, she told him some families are leaving Bradford Creek. They say they don't feel right living there anymore. Roland only nodded. Good. Maybe that land will finally rest. Tanya pressed her hand to the glass, tears welling. "Uncle, I don't want this to be how people remember you." He smiled faintly. "Better remembered with anger than erased." In silence, she whispered, "I just wish there had been another way." Roland leaned closer, his voice steady. So do I, but when no one listens. Sometimes the water speaks louder than words. Out in the subdivision, that truth lingered. Families tried to repair their homes, but the neighborhood never felt whole again. At block parties, conversations carried an uneasy weight. Parents who once bragged about their investments now avoided eye contact when Roland's name came up. And Marjorie, still wearing her pearls, could no longer command respect. Behind closed doors, neighbors whispered about how she had led them into disaster. Clarence, sitting on Tanya's porch one evening as the sun sank low, put it plainly, your uncle forced the question no one wanted to ask: what matters more? The land we stand on, or the people who built their lives on it first? Tanya nodded softly. He made them see. Even if they hate him for it, he made them see. And that was the truth no one could bury. Progress built on theft isn't progress at all. It's a fragile facade, one that crumbles at the first flood. Roland had torn that illusion apart with one turn of a wheel that echoed louder than decades of ignored warnings. For Roland, legacy was never about property or wealth. It was about memory, about making sure his grandfather's sweat and his father's struggles weren't erased under vinyl siding and glossy brochures. He had lost his freedom, but in doing so, he carved his family's name into the conscience of a community that once pretended he didn't exist. And maybe that's the lesson: one bigger than Bradford Creek, bigger than Fayetteville. Respect isn't optional. History isn't disposable. You can't build a future worth living in by erasing those who came before you. So ask yourself, what would you have done in Roland's place? Would you have stayed silent? Or would you have turned the wheel, knowing the risk, knowing the cost, but refusing to let your legacy be stolen in plain sight? That is the weight of this story a man dismissed and ignored until he forced the world to remember him. If this story moved you, if it made you think about justice, legacy, and what it means to stand your ground, subscribe for more. Because stories like Roland's remind us that the past doesn't vanish. It waits for someone to defend it. And sometimes that someone has to be you. Because when the water speaks, the whole world listens.